Hello, dear sewistas! Today, I would like to sew this summery jersey dress for children. The pattern for the little dress is available on our pattydoo designer. There, you can decide between several different versions. You have the choice of sewing the dress with or without sleeves, and furthermore, you can select whether the dress should be one continuous piece or with a skirt part. This is available in two lengths, the options being a gathered skirt or a flounce one. In this video, I would now like to show you how to sew the dress without sleeves and how to edge the neckline and armholes with a strip of jersey fabric. Furthermore, we will sew the flounce skirt option and a seam with a twin needle. Lastly, I will also show you how to sew on the skirt with the gathering. Here, I have already prepared the pattern pieces for the dress without sleeves. We need the front part and the back part. And there, we here have two flounced skirt pieces, which are semicircular, and on top of this, a long jersey strip to edge the neckline and the armholes. Using a rotary cutter, a cutting mat, and a patchwork ruler makes the cutting of jersey fabrics particularly easy and accurate. Serger or coverlock sewing machines are especially suited to sewing jersey, but you can also easily do this with a normal sewing machine. How to do so, I would like to show you today. I will now be working with my sewing machine by Pfaff. If you would like to find out a bit more about this model, then simply click on the link below. In my tutorial video for the shirt Elaine, I have already given you a few tips how you use a normal household sewing machine when sewing jersey fabrics. For example, you should definitely use a jersey needle. Also, you can check whether your sewing machine has a specific jersey stitch. If you're working with a normal straight stitch or a zig-zag stitch, then set the stitch length to as small as possible and reduce the thread tension. If it is possible, also reduce the pressure of the presser foot. It would also be particularly useful to have an additional top feed. This prevents the fabric from being stretched too much while sewing. They are either available as an accessory or already integrated, like on this model. I would definitely recommend to test all of your settings on a practice piece before you get started on sewing your lovely dress. We will do so now and begin sewing at the shoulder seam. In doing so, we lay the front piece and the back piece right sides together and then sew along this little bit here. When you're laying the fabric under the presser foot, make sure that you place something behind the needle, so the fabric isn't pulled through this little hole here. I will now be using a zigzag stitch set to very narrow with a small stitch density and a seam allowance of 7 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch. Now, I'll just sew back by a few stitches to seal the seam beginning. So, this is what the finished shoulder seam looks like now. Next, we can fold our piece apart and sew our fabric strip to this long length of the neckline. We will be doing this in 2 steps and begin by sewing the strip to the inside. We lay the fabric strip with the right side on the wrong side of the shirt. And I will not be pinning or clipping it in place because the strip will be stretched along the curve while it's being sewn on. Now, I will sew the strip on with a seam allowance of 7 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch and stretch it slightly while making sure the shirt remains unstretched. When the curve becomes somewhat more enhanced, here at the deepest point, I will stretch the strip a little more. Here at the straight part, in the transition to the shoulder, I'll stretch it a little less again. Now we are on the back piece, which is curved somewhat stronger here at the neckline, and here I'll have to stretch a little more. This is what the sewn-on strip looks like now. How much you'll have to stretch it depends entirely on the elasticity of the fabric. But make sure you don't overstretch it, so the shirt doesn't become wrinkly here. Since the fabric strip is somewhat longer than the neckline, we can just shorten this little end here. In the next step, we fold the neckline strip over and then fold it to the outside. Then we pin it in place and sew it on. When you are finished with this, you can sew on the strip and you can either use the stitch you have been using previously or use another decorative stitch, like a zigzag or an elastic stitch available on your sewing machine. Or you could, like I will be doing, use a twin needle. I would advise to check the instruction manual for your sewing machine on how to thread it. Usually, there's an extra attachment for the second thread spool. I will now be using a normal straight stitch with a small stitch length, which is set as 2 on my machine. I will now set the thread tension a little higher to make sure the lower thread lies nicely flat. And now I sew closely to this edge here, while making sure the strip covers the first seam. Thus, our neckline is nicely covered on the outside and inside. Here's another little tip. I would recommend using a cotton thread for the lower thread in the spool, not a polyester one, so it doesn't scratch your skin later. If the neckline is a little wavy now after sewing, you can easily whip that back into shape by ironing it. When everything is nice and smooth, we can continue to the next step and close this shoulder seam here. In order to do so, we lay both pieces right sides together. I will now begin sewing on this side and have already changed my settings to a small zigzag stitch. Now, we cut off these overhanging ends here and fold the seam allowance into the back piece. Then we affix the neckline strip here with a short seam so it lies flat here at the shoulder. And because the spot is now really thick, I will take a folded up piece of fabric and lay it under the back bit of the presser foot. This way, it's nice and straight and I have an easier time starting to sew here. And now, I just sew back and forth a few times. So, this part should look like this now, and next we can edge the two armholes in the exact same way we just did on the neckline. To do so, we fold open the dress and sew on the strip to the wrong side here, then fold it outwards and sew it on the right side with the twin needle. This is what the finished armholes and neckline look like. If you can't get it done properly on the first try, don't be disheartened. Just experiment on a trial piece until you've found all the thread and stitch settings that work for you. Next, we will continue with the skirt. First, I will show you the version with the flounce and then the skirt with the gathers. If you only want to see this one, you can now just fast forward with a click. The two flounce skirt pieces will now be individually and flatly sewn onto the front and the back piece. To do so, lay the pieces right sides together and sew them on. This time, I have set my machine to an overlock stitch and inserted a fitting presser foot. Why don't you have a look at the accessories for your sewing machine? Maybe you also have some of these attachments. When the skirt pieces have been sewn on, we can proceed with closing the side seams. Because we will be starting here at the thicker part, I will place something under my presser foot. Make sure that the seams on the skirt piece meet up here and the seam allowance is folded downwards. When you have closed the side seams, you can subsequently sew down the border strip in the same way we did on the shoulder. Last but not least, we can iron the hem, and in doing so, fold the lower hem edge over by 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. Then, I would recommend pinning the ironed edge in place on the right side. While ironing, you can simultaneously maintain the long, outwardly curved edge, which means through the ironing you will shorten it somewhat and thus ensure it doesn't wrinkle and lies nice and flat. The hem we will now sew with our twin needle. This way, we simultaneously serge the inside edge. We will now begin on the left shoulder seam and sew on the right fabric side. The distance to the lower edge should be 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. On most sewing machines, there is usually a little attachment with which you can set the distance to the needle. Otherwise, you can also just stick down a piece of tape here. I have set the thread tension somewhat lower now, so the fabric doesn't pucker between the stitches. Every so often, just check the wrong side to ensure the stitch is nicely covering the fabric edge. This is what the finished hem seam looks like now. Next, we can iron the edge and also press down the seam a little, just in case it's bulging a bit. You can also sew this children's dress with a gathered skirt, and how that works I will show you now. To do so, I will now sew the version of the dress where the skirt is sewn on just underneath the chest. For this, I have already sewn together the bodice part except for this one side seam. This is the dress version with sleeves, more specifically the puffed sleeves. How those are sewn, you can see in my video tutorial for the women's shirt Live, via this link. Using the puffed sleeves, I also show you how a gather with 2 seams is done in that video. You can do it just the same on the skirt here. But now, I will also be showing you a different way here. For this option, we will need an aid, which is this transparent elastic tape, which is available in stores under the name Framelon or Framelastic. And now we will start with the first step, which is cutting the tape to the length of the edge of the top. In the next step, similar to sewing on a cuff, we can mark the half and quarter length of the tape with some pins or little clips. The skirt, which is cut in the fold, is longer than the top piece, and now we will shorten it by gathering it to the length of the tape. To do so, we make little notches here at the edge to mark the half and quarter lengths. Now, we pin the Framelon tape to the fabric's edge, whereby the clips meet the notches. And next, we will sew on the tape and stretch it while doing so. We now sew on the tape very closely to the fabric edge with a large zigzag stitch. I lay the fabric with the tape behind the presser foot. I make just a few stitches, and now I can hold onto it all here at the end. And begin stretching the tape while sewing. While sewing it on, make sure that you are evenly stretching the elastic band, but not the fabric. Thus, we have gathered the skirt piece to the correct length in one step. Now, we can pin it directly to the top piece and sew it on. We lay both pieces right sides together and begin here at the side seam. Then, the first notch meets the front center here at this incision. The second notch meets the side seam. And the last one meets this notch here, which is the back middle of the top piece. In between, we can place a few more pins or clips. Now, we sew on the skirt with an elastic or an overlock stitch. You can now decide which fabric length will lie on top while sewing, either the smooth side of the top or the gather side of the skirt. I now have the skirt lying on top because then I'm a little more in control of the folds. So, our skirt seam now looks like this on the inside and like this on the outside. All further working steps are now exactly the same as on the previous jersey dress, which means we now sew the second side seam from the sleeve up here to the hem, then fold over the hem edge and sew it down with a twin needle. And now our kids' jersey dresses are done. You can find further versions of the dress and many other patterns on pattydoo. I hope you enjoy sewing your own dress.